Married for 50 years, half a century of sweat, loyalty, and building a life from the ground up. I was left with nothing, betrayed and thrown away by the very people I bled for. Just when I thought I was going to die, a forgotten, broke old man in the freezing rain, I stumbled upon a secret house no one knew about. A $25 million hidden fortress that changed my life and gave me the ultimate revenge. It is 11 o'clock at night. The Seattle rain is coming down in heavy freezing sheets, cold and completely unforgiving. I am 79 years old. I am standing on the front porch of a $3 million estate. My estate. The one I built with my own two hands. The porch light is off, leaving me completely in the dark. My clothes are soaked through to my bones. The chill is creeping into my joints, making my chest ache with every breath I take. At my feet sits a single cheap black trash bag. Inside that bag are 2 pairs of old pants, a few wrinkled shirts, and my shaving kit. That is all I have left in this entire world. I press my face against the cold glass of the large front window. Inside, the living room is bathed in warm golden light. The fireplace is roaring cheerfully. I laid every single brick of that fireplace myself 30 years ago, working late into the night, so my family would always be warm. Sitting on the expensive leather sofa is Martha, my wife of 50 years. She is wearing a silk robe I bought for her just last Christmas. Next to her is my 48-year-old son Jason and his wife Rachel. They are not arguing. They are not frantically looking for me. They are holding crystal glasses filled with expensive champagne. They are laughing. I reach out with a trembling hand and press my fingers against the electronic lock on the front door. The metal keypad is slick with rain. I punch in the numbers. 1974. The year Martha and I got married. A sharp, angry red light flashes on the small screen. Access denied. I try again, my wet fingers slipping on the keys. Access denied. The door code has been changed. The locks have been wiped. I have been completely erased from my own home. Behind me, a police cruiser is parked in the middle of the large, circular driveway. Its red and blue emergency lights are silently flashing, reflecting off the wet pavement and illuminating the heavy raindrops as they fall. 2 young police officers are standing a few feet away from me. They have their yellow raincoats pulled tight against the storm. They look uncomfortable, shifting their weight from side to side, but they are not here to help me get inside. They are here to make sure I do not break the glass. "Mr. Caldwell, you need to step away from the door," the younger officer says. His voice is loud enough to be heard over the pouring rain, but there is a distinct trace of pity in it. I look back at him. My hands are shaking. Not just from the freezing cold, but from a shock so deep it feels like my heart has stopped beating. These hands are covered in thick white scars from 40 years of pouring concrete and building commercial towers for this city. I worked 80-hour weeks so my son would never know what it feels like to be hungry. I sacrificed my own health to build an empire for my family. And now I cannot even step inside my own foyer to get out of the storm. I try to explain it to the officers again. My voice cracks, sounding weak and pathetic even to my own ears. I tell them I built this house. I tell them my wife is inside. I tell them I just had minor heart surgery 2 years ago and I cannot be out in this freezing weather. The older officer sighs heavily and pulls a waterproof folder from his jacket. He opens it and shines his heavy flashlight on a stack of legal documents. "I am very sorry, sir," the officer says softly. "We ran the property records just like your son requested when he called us. Your name is not on the deed. The property is legally owned by a private trust controlled by Jason Caldwell and Martha Caldwell. You have no legal right to enter these premises. If you try to force your way in, your son has made it clear he wants to press charges for trespassing." Trespassing. The word hits me like a physical blow to the stomach. It knocks the wind right out of me. I turn my head and look through the window one last time. Jason has stood up. He walks casually over to the glass. He is still holding his champagne glass. He looks right at me standing out there in the miserable rain with the police. For a second, my foolish fatherly heart expects him to open the door to say, "This is all a huge mistake, a terrible joke," but he does not. Jason looks right into my eyes, and he smiles, a slow, arrogant, completely heartless smirk. He raises his glass toward me in a mock toast, takes a sip, and pulls the heavy curtains shut. The warm light disappears. I am left alone in the dark. "You need to gather your belongings and leave the property," Mr. Caldwell, the younger officer, says, stepping closer to make sure I comply. "We can drop you off at a shelter downtown if you need a ride, but you cannot stay here." I look down at my calloused hands. The betrayal is so absolute, so vicious, that I do not even have tears left to cry. My own wife, my own son. They did not just kick me out in a moment of anger. They planned this. They waited for a night when the weather was brutal. They waited until they had legally drained every ounce of power I had. I reach down and pick up the black trash bag. It feels incredibly heavy, like I am carrying the corpse of my own family. I decline the ride to the shelter. I tell the officers my old 20-year-old pickup truck is parked down the street. It is the only thing left in my name. As I walk down the long, winding driveway, the freezing rain washing over my face, I realize that the man who lived in that house is dead. They killed him tonight. They discarded a 79-year-old man like a piece of garbage, expecting me to quietly fade away into nothing. But what Jason and Martha do not know is that before I was a tired old man, I was a survivor. They think I am walking away with nothing. They think they have won the war. But they have no idea what is waiting for them in the shadows. This was only the beginning. Let me take you back to exactly 48 hours before I found myself standing in the freezing rain. 2 days earlier, my life was perfectly normal, or at least I thought it was. It was a Tuesday morning. The Seattle sun was actually shining for once, casting long, peaceful shadows across the hardwood kitchen floor. I had woken up early just like I have every day for the past 40 years. I walked into the kitchen to brew a pot of dark roast coffee. My joints were a little stiff, a familiar reminder of decades spent climbing steel scaffolding and hauling concrete blocks. But I felt good. I felt secure. I reached for a new coffee filter and tossed the plastic wrapping into the stainless steel trash can next to the island. That is when I saw it. A crumpled piece of paper sitting right on top of the coffee grounds from the day before. Now, I am not a man who makes a habit of digging through the garbage, but something about the thick, official-looking bank paper caught my eye. It was not a grocery receipt. It had the distinct blue watermark of our private wealth management bank. I reached in, pulled it out, and smoothed the wrinkled page flat against the marble countertop. I put on my reading glasses. What I saw made my breath catch in my throat. It was a confirmation of a wire transfer. $500,000 had been moved from my joint retirement savings directly into a commercial account registered to Jason Caldwell Real Estate Holdings. $500,000, just gone, transferred out at 4 p.m. the previous day. My heart started hammering against my ribs. I had to read the numbers 3 times to make sure my aging eyes were not playing tricks on me. 500,000. It was real. A massive chunk of the safety net I had bled to build was simply wiped away. My mind raced. Had we been hacked? Had someone stolen our identities? I reached for the kitchen phone to call the bank fraud department immediately. Just as my fingers touched the receiver, I heard the soft padding of slippers on the hardwood floor. Martha walked into the kitchen. She looked perfectly serene, wearing her silk bathrobe, her hair neatly brushed. She smiled at me, a warm, familiar smile that I had trusted for 50 years. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said, walking past me to get her favorite ceramic mug. I did not say good morning back. I held up the crumpled bank receipt. My hand was shaking slightly. "Martha," I said, my voice tight. What is this? Why is there a wire transfer for $500,000 to Jason's business account? I found it in the trash. The silence in the kitchen stretched out heavy and suffocating. The coffee machine beeped softly behind me, signaling that the pot was ready, but neither of us moved. The smell of the dark roast, which usually brought me so much comfort, suddenly made my stomach churn. Martha stopped. She did not look panicked. She did not drop her mug. Instead, her smile softened into a look of gentle, almost condescending pity. She poured her coffee, took a slow sip, and leaned against the counter. "Oh, Harrison," she sighed, shaking her head slightly. "We talked about this." "Do you not remember?" I stared at her, completely stunned. "Talked about this, you echoed my voice, rising in disbelief. "When did we talk about giving our son $500,000? I looked down at the receipt again, my thumb brushing over the printed numbers. 50 years of marriage. 50 years of sharing everything, trusting her implicitly with my life and my livelihood, and she was standing there lying to my face without batting an eye. The absolute audacity of it left me completely breathless. Martha walked over and placed a comforting hand on my arm. I flinched, but she kept it there, patting me gently, like a confused child. "Last week, Harrison," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Jason is closing a massive commercial deal downtown. The financing got delayed by a few days because of some paperwork red tape. He just needed a temporary bridge loan to secure the property until the bank funds clear next week. He will pay it right back." "You told him it was a great idea. You really are getting forgetful lately, honey. Maybe we should schedule an appointment with Dr. Evans." I stood frozen. She delivered the lie so perfectly, with such practiced ease, that for a split second, I actually doubted my own sanity. Was my memory failing? Did I have a conversation I completely forgot, but then the fog cleared? I am 79, but my mind is as sharp as the day I drafted my first set of blueprints. I did not forget anything. I had never agreed to this. And more importantly, her story made absolutely no logical sense. You see, I spent 4 decades as a commercial builder. I know the real estate business inside and out. When a legitimate commercial developer needs a temporary bridge loan to cover a gap in financing, they do not secretly take it from their elderly father's retirement account. A real estate firm demanding $500,000 in liquid cash overnight from a family member is not securing a property. They are plugging a bleeding hole. They are drowning. I looked at Martha's face. The loving wife mask was firmly in place, but I noticed a slight tightness around her eyes. She was watching me closely, waiting to see if I would swallow the bait. If I had been a retired school teacher or an accountant, maybe I would have believed her. But I spent my entire life reading structural weaknesses. When a foundation is cracked, you cannot hide it with a fresh coat of paint. My gut was screaming at me. This was no bridge loan. This was theft. I needed to know the truth. I looked Martha in the eye, gave her a slow nod, and decided to play along. She relaxed visibly, thinking the crisis was averted. She thought I was blind, but she had no idea that she had just forced me to open my eyes. I played the part of the oblivious, fading old man for the rest of the week. I smiled over the dinner table. I drank the tea she poured for me. I watched television in my recliner and nodded whenever she spoke. But inside my mind was working with the calculated precision of an engineer looking for a fatal flaw. I knew that if I confronted her without having all the facts, she would simply weave another web of lies. She was too good at it. I needed undeniable proof. I needed to see the foundation of whatever scheme they were running. So I waited. Patience is a virtue you learn very well when you spend your life waiting for concrete to cure. By Sunday morning, the tension in my chest was almost unbearable. Martha spent an hour getting ready for her weekly church group. She came downstairs wearing a tasteful pearl necklace and a navy blue dress, looking like the absolute picture of a devoted wife. She kissed my cheek and told me she would be back by noon to make a nice roast for lunch. I told her to have a wonderful time and watched through the front window as she backed her car out of the driveway. The moment her taillights disappeared, the charade was completely over. I walked directly into my home office and locked the heavy oak door behind me. The house was completely silent. It was that thick, heavy kind of silence that happens right before a storm breaks. I sat down at my desk and pulled out my personal address book. I found the direct line for Richard Sterling. Richard was the senior wealth manager at my private bank. I had known him for over 20 years. He was the man who had helped me set up the joint retirement account when I finally sold my construction firm. My hands were remarkably steady as I picked up the heavy brass receiver of the landline and dialed his number. I punched in the priority code he had given me years ago for absolute emergencies. It took about 3 minutes for Richard to call me back. I could hear the faint sound of his children playing in the background. "Harrison," he said, his voice carrying a mix of warmth and professional curiosity. "It is good to hear from you. I hope everything is all right." I did not waste any time with pleasantries. The time for polite conversation was over. "Richard," I said, keeping my voice low and level, "I need you to pull up my joint retirement portfolio right now. I need a complete verbal audit of every transaction made in the last 90 days, and I need to know the exact current balance to the penny." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The sound of the children playing in the background was suddenly muffled. "Harrison," he started, his tone shifting from friendly to extremely cautious. "Are you sure you need me to do this right now? I thought we were all clear on the transition strategy. I have been sending the monthly statements directly to Jason, just as requested." My blood ran completely cold. The temperature in my home office seemed to drop 10 degrees in a matter of seconds. Transition strategy statements sent to Jason. I closed my eyes and gripped the edge of my mahogany desk so hard my knuckles turned white. "Richard," I said, forcing the words out through a tight throat, "just open the file and read me the balance." I heard the faint clicking of a computer keyboard. It felt like every keystroke was a nail being driven into a coffin. Then Richard took a deep breath. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Harrison, the current balance of the primary joint retirement account is exactly 0. The secondary money market sweep account is also at 0. I stopped breathing. For a few seconds, the world simply ceased to exist. I was floating in a dark, empty void. 0. $2.5 million. 40 years of broken fingernails, aching joints, working through holidays, and missing anniversaries just to make sure my family would never know poverty. All of it. Gone. The $500,000 wire transfer I found in the trash was not a bridge loan. It was the final nail. It was the last scrape of the barrel. "Where did it go, Richard?" I asked. My voice sounded like it belonged to a ghost. He hesitated, clearly sensing the panic rising in the silence. "It was transferred out in a series of 6 wire movements over the last 3 months," he explained, his professional demeanor slipping into genuine concern. "All of the funds were moved into the corporate accounts of Jason Caldwell Real Estate Holdings." "Harrison, first have to ask, is everything all right? You authorized these transfers." I leaned back in my leather chair, staring blankly at the ceiling. Martha. It had to be Martha. She was the only other person on the joint account. She must have gone into the bank, forged my signature, and moved the money to our son. The betrayal was staggering, but I needed to confirm the mechanics of the theft. "Richard," I said, my voice hardening into steel, "look at the authorization signatures on those wire transfers. Tell me my wife did this." There was another agonizing pause as Richard clicked through the digital files. "Harrison," he said quietly, "Martha did not sign these wire authorizations. The primary joint account requires your specific signature for any transfer." "Then how the hell did the money move?" I demanded. "I did not sign those damn papers." "I know you did not sign them in person, Harrison," Richard replied, his voice trembling now. "The authorizations were legally executed through your power of attorney. Your son authorized every single transfer himself. It was my own flesh and blood. He secretly used medical documents to rob me completely blind." I hung up the phone without saying another word to Richard. The heavy brass receiver slipped from my trembling fingers and clattered onto the plastic base. My home office, usually a sanctuary of quiet reflection and peace, suddenly felt like a prison cell shrinking around me. My own flesh and blood. My only son. The boy I had taught to throw a baseball in the backyard. The boy I had paid to put through an expensive private college had completely destroyed my life, and he had used my own fatherly trust as the ultimate weapon. I pushed myself away from the heavy mahogany desk. My legs felt like solid lead, but I forced myself to stand up. I walked over to the oil painting of the Seattle skyline hanging on the far wall. I swung the large painting aside to reveal the steel wall safe hidden right behind it. My hands were shaking so violently that it took me 3 separate attempts to spin the metal dial to the correct combination. The heavy steel door finally clicked and swung open. The safe was where I kept all our vital family records and sensitive legal documents. I reached inside and pulled out the thick, red, expandable folder labeled Legal and Medical. I carried it over to my desk, my heart hammering a frantic, painful rhythm against my ribs. I dumped the contents onto the green leather blotter. Papers scattered everywhere across the wood surface. I ignored the birth certificates, the old car titles, and the old insurance policies. I was frantically searching for one specific document. The single document that had just authorized the massive theft of $2.5 million. I found it buried near the very bottom of the paper pile. It was a 12-page legal contract. Across the top in bold black letters it read, "General Durable Power of Attorney." Seeing those printed words sent a fresh cold wave of nausea washing directly over me. The memory of signing this very document came rushing back to my mind. 2 years ago, I had a terrifying minor scare. My doctor found a slight blockage in one of my arteries and strongly recommended a routine stent procedure. It was a simple, low-risk surgery, but at 77 years old. Anytime you go under heavy anesthesia, there is always a small, lingering shadow of doubt. Jason had come over to the house the night before the scheduled surgery. He looked so genuinely worried about my health. He held my hand tightly, looked me right in the eyes, and told me how much he loved me. He said he wanted to make sure everything was properly taken care of, just in case there were any unexpected complications during the medical procedure. He presented this document to me, explaining calmly it was just a standard medical and financial proxy. He promised it would only ever be used if I was totally incapacitated and unable to make decisions for myself. He said it was just a temporary safety net to protect his mother and to make sure the hospital bills could be paid without any long legal delays. Like an absolute fool, like a trusting, loving father, I did not read the fine print. I signed my name right on the dotted line. Now sitting alone at my desk, I read every single terrible word of that binding document. It was not a temporary safety net. It was not strictly limited to medical emergencies. It was a sweeping, unconditional surrender of every legal right I possessed in this world. I had legally granted Jason total unrestricted authority to act on my behalf in all financial and real estate matters, effective immediately upon signing. He did not need a specialized doctor to declare me legally incompetent. He had the absolute power the second the black ink dried on the paper. He had just been patiently waiting for the right moment to pull the trigger. And Martha absolutely knew. She had to know everything. You do not quietly transfer $2.5 million out of a joint retirement account without the other spouse noticing, unless you are both actively in on the scam. I kept digging through the red folder, my rising panic rapidly turning into a cold, hard rage. If Jason had successfully used this document to drain the bank accounts, What else had he secretly done? I found another thick envelope from the county recorder office dated exactly 3 weeks ago. I ripped it open instantly. It was a property deed, but it was not the original deed I had signed 30 years ago when I built this beautiful house. It was a brand new transfer of title. According to this stamped piece of paper, Harrison Caldwell had legally gifted the $3 million property to the Caldwell Family Private Trust. And the sole acting trustees listed clearly on the document were Jason Caldwell and Martha Caldwell. They had literally stolen the ground right out from under my feet. I did not legally own the house anymore. I did not own the life savings. I did not even own the comfortable chair I was currently sitting in. They had methodically, quietly, and completely stripped me of my entire life work while I was sitting right across the dinner table from them. It was an absolute masterclass in family deception. The woman I had slept next to for 50 long years and the boy I had raised from an infant had conspired together to leave me completely destitute. The heavy silence of the house was suddenly broken by the loud sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway outside my window. I looked over at the antique grandfather clock ticking softly in the corner. It was exactly noon. Martha was home from her Sunday church group. Soon Jason would arrive for our usual Sunday family lunch. The loving wife and the devoted son were coming through the front door, fully expecting to find the same foolish, blind old man they had left behind that morning. I slowly gathered the printed bank statements and the forged property deed. I stood up straight from my desk. The initial shock was entirely gone now. The crushing sadness had completely evaporated into thin air. All that remained in my chest was a burning white-hot anger. I stepped out into the wide, sunlit hallway, listening to the heavy oak front door swing open. The sound of cheerful laughter echoed through the foyer. It was Martha, my loving wife, returning from her Sunday service, accompanied by Jason and his wife Rachel. They were casually discussing where to make dinner reservations, their voices light and carefree. I listened to the clatter of Martha hanging up her coat, the sound of Jason tossing his expensive car keys onto the silver entryway tray. It was a perfectly normal, mundane domestic scene. But to me, listening from the shadows of the hallway, it sounded like a pack of wolves returning to the den after slaughtering the sheep. I stepped out into the open space of the living room just as they walked in. Martha stopped in her tracks, a pleasant, practiced smile instantly forming on her face. Jason looked up from his phone, raising an eyebrow in mild surprise. "Hey, Dad," he said, his tone entirely casual. "Mom said you were taking it easy today. You feeling all right? You look a little pale." I did not say a word. I walked slowly and deliberately over to the heavy glass coffee table in the center of the room. I raised my hand and slammed the thick stack of printed bank statements and the forged property deed down onto the glass surface. The loud smack echoed sharply across the room, cutting their cheerful banter dead in the air. Rachel gasped slightly, taking a step back. "I want my money back," I said. My voice was dangerously calm, devoid of any shouting or hysteria. It was the voice of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. "I want the $2.5 million you stole from my retirement account, and I want the deed to this house restored to my name by tomorrow morning." For a moment, nobody moved. The silence in the living room was absolute, suffocating and thick. I watched the fake, loving smile slowly melt right off Martha's face. The transformation was truly terrifying to witness. The sweet church-going woman I had kissed goodbye just a few hours ago completely vanished. In her place stood a cold, hard, calculating stranger. She did not look guilty. She did not look ashamed. She looked annoyed. Jason let out a long, heavy sigh and rubbed the back of his neck. He stepped forward, putting his hands in his pockets, adopting the arrogant posture of a corporate executive dealing with a disgruntled employee. "Look, Dad, let us not be dramatic," he said, rolling his eyes. "Nobody stole anything. You signed the power of attorney. You gave me legal authority to manage the family assets. I am simply restructuring our financial portfolio to maximize returns for the estate. You should be thanking me. You do not understand how modern real estate investing works." I stepped closer to him. My fists clenched so tight my fingernails dug painfully into my palms. "Do not insult my intelligence," I whispered. "You used a medical proxy I signed before a heart surgery to quietly drain every single penny I worked 40 years to save. You transferred my home into a private trust. You robbed your own father blind." Martha finally spoke. Her voice was like crushed ice, devoid of any warmth or affection. "Oh, stop your pathetic whining, Harrison," she snapped, crossing her arms over her chest. "You have always been so utterly obsessed with your money. You have lived your entire life like a paranoid miser. Jason needed capital for his business. You have been sitting on millions of dollars doing absolutely nothing with it, just watching it gather dust in a bank account while your son struggled to grow his company. You have lived long enough. It is his turn now." I stared at her, my heart breaking into a million irreparable pieces. 50 years, Martha," I said, my voice cracking despite my best efforts to stay strong. "I gave you 50 years of my life. I built this house for you. I provided everything you ever asked for. How could you possibly do this to me?" She looked me right in the eyes, her expression completely flat. "Because I am tired of you, Harrison," she said smoothly, without a single ounce of hesitation. "I am tired of your boring routines, your cheap habits, and your constant need for control. In fact, since you've already figured it out, I might as well save us the trouble of pretending. I filed the divorce papers first thing yesterday morning. My lawyer will be contacting you next week. But honestly, there is nothing left for you to fight over. The assets are protected. You do not own anything anymore." The sheer brutality of her words hit me like a physical blow. Divorce, the assets are protected. She had planned every single detail of my financial execution. Jason let out a short, cruel laugh. "Let us face reality." "Dad," he sneered, his face twisting into an ugly expression of pure contempt. "You are a useless old dinosaur. You belong to a different era. You spent your whole life pouring concrete like a mindless laborer. You do not understand high-level finance. I am taking the family legacy to the next level. You were just in the way. It is time for you to step aside and let the adults handle the real business." I felt a surge of adrenaline flood my system. I raised my hand and pointed a trembling finger right at his face. "Get out!" I roared, the anger finally boiling over. "Both of you! Get out of my house right now!" Jason just smirked. He reached into his tailored jacket and pulled out his cell phone. "It is not your house anymore, old man," he said coldly. He dialed a number and held the phone to his ear, never breaking eye contact with me. "Yes. Neighborhood security, and I would like you to dispatch the local police as well. I have a hostile trespasser refusing to leave my private property." "Yes, my father. He is becoming aggressive, and I fear for the safety of my wife and mother." I stood there completely paralyzed by the sheer sociopathic ease with which he lied. Rachel walked over to the wet bar and calmly began pouring 3 glasses of expensive champagne, completely ignoring my presence. Martha turned her back to me and sat down on the leather sofa, adjusting her silk robe. They were treating me like an unwanted stray dog that had wandered into their pristine living room. Within 10 minutes, the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers illuminated the large front window. The rain had started to fall outside, heavy and cold. The officers knocked on the door, and Jason let them in, playing the role of the concerned patient son, dealing with the confused, angry elder. He showed them the trust documents. He showed them the property deed. It was all perfectly legal. The trap had snapped shut, flawlessly executed. The police gave me 5 minutes to pack a single trash bag of clothes, and just like that, I was escorted out the front door, stepping out into the freezing Seattle storm, bringing me exactly to the moment where this entire nightmare began. I sat in my old pickup truck, the engine idling loudly in the pouring Seattle rain. The heater was barely working, blowing a weak stream of lukewarm air against my soaking wet clothes. I stared through the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers at the glowing taillights of the police cruisers as they pulled out of my driveway and disappeared into the night. My house, the beautiful estate I had built with my own hands, stood dark and silent like a fortress. I put the truck into gear and drove away, carrying me away from the life I knew. I drove aimlessly for what felt like hours. Every illuminated window I passed reminded me of the warmth and security I had just lost. Eventually, the gas gauge dipped dangerously low, forcing me to pull into a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city. The glowing neon sign above the office flickered with a harsh light, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. I grabbed my single black trash bag and walked into the small reception area. The clerk looked at my dripping wet clothes and sighed, sliding a registration card through the narrow slot. I pulled my wallet from my damp pocket. I handed the clerk my platinum card to pay for a single night. He swiped it through the machine. It beeped an angry flat tone. "Declined," he said, not even looking up. I frowned, my hands shaking from the cold, and handed him another card. A gold rewards card I had used for 20 years. He swiped it. Declined again. "Sir," the clerk said with deep impatience, "do you have a card that actually works? Or do you have cash?" A cold knot tightened in the pit of my stomach. Jason had not just drained the bank accounts and stolen the house. With that power of attorney, he had completely shut down every single line of credit I possessed. He intentionally cut off my resources, ensuring I could not hire a lawyer or buy a warm meal. He wanted me completely helpless. I dug into the hidden compartment of my wallet and pulled out a $50 bill I always kept for emergencies. I slid it under the glass. The clerk handed me a heavy metal key attached to a cheap plastic tag. "Room 114, he muttered, pointing toward the back. The motel room was small and smelled faintly of stale cigarette smoke and cheap cleaning chemicals. The carpet was stained, and the thin bedspread looked like it had not been washed in months. I dropped my trash bag onto the floor and sat heavily on the edge of the mattress. The springs groaned loudly beneath my weight. I was 79 years old. Yesterday I was a wealthy, respected, retired builder enjoying the fruits of a lifetime of hard labor. Tonight, I sat in a roadside motel room, shivering in wet clothes, completely alone. I pulled my phone from my jacket pocket. The screen was cracked, but it still worked. I opened my banking application. My primary accounts were gone, completely erased from the dashboard, as if they had never existed. But I had one small emergency account. It was a simple checking account I had opened at a local credit union years ago just to hold some petty cash for my truck repairs. Jason did not know about it, because I never connected it to our main portfolio. I typed in my password, my fingers clumsy and numb. Available balance: $800.00. $800. That was the absolute sum total of my net worth, the mathematical valuation of my entire existence. The sheer psychological weight of that number crashed down on me with the force of a collapsing brick wall. 50 years of marriage. 50 years of waking up at dawn, breathing in concrete dust, and sacrificing my dreams to build a legacy for my family. And this was my reward. $800 and a plastic room key. I leaned forward and buried my face in my rough hands. The dam finally broke. A deep, agonizing sob tore out of my throat, tearing through the quiet, depressing room. I wept for the wife who had smiled at me over breakfast while secretly plotting my absolute ruin. I wept for the son who had looked me in the eye and called me a useless old dinosaur while stealing my savings. They took my history. They took every happy memory we ever shared and poisoned it. Every birthday, every Christmas, every vacation now felt like a carefully orchestrated lie. The emotional pain was so severe, it manifested as a sharp ache in the center of my chest. For a terrifying moment, I wondered if my old heart was finally giving out. Maybe this was exactly what Jason and Martha were hoping for. Maybe they were banking on the stress and the cold finally killing me off, tying up their single loose end perfectly. If I died in this cheap motel room, they would not even have to pay for a funeral. They would just sweep my ashes under the rug and move into their wealthy lives without a second thought. I sat there in the dark for hours, letting the grief wash over me in agonizing waves. The rain battered against the thin glass of the single motel window, a harsh, relentless sound that matched the desolation in my soul. I was effectively homeless. I had no friends to call, no family to turn to, and no legal standing to fight back. The despair was a living, breathing monster in the room with me, whispering that it was time to just give up. It whispered that I should just lie back on that dirty mattress, close my eyes, and let the darkness take me. But as I reached down to pull a dry shirt from my trash bag, my hand brushed against something hard and solid hidden near the bottom. It was the heavy mahogany keepsake box my father had given me the day I started my construction business. I had hastily shoved it into the trash bag right before the police escorted me out, desperate to save the few photographs and small mementos inside. My fingers, numb from the freezing rain and trembling from the sheer exhaustion of the night, struggled to grip the smooth wood. As I pulled it free from the damp clothing, the box slipped right through my hands. It hit the cheap linoleum floor of the motel room with a sharp, cracking sound. The impact split the old wood right down the middle. I fell to my knees, a fresh wave of grief washing over me. I had managed to break the last physical connection I had to my father. But as I reached down to carefully gather the splintered pieces, I noticed something strange. The thick wooden base of the box had completely detached, revealing a hidden compartment underneath. A false bottom. I stared at it, my heart suddenly beating a little faster. Sitting perfectly preserved inside that shallow, concealed space was a thick, dusty manila envelope. I had owned that box for over 50 years, and I had absolutely no idea this compartment even existed. My father must have built it himself. I carefully reached down and pulled the envelope free. The paper was dry and brittle, yellowed with age. The metal clasp at the top was slightly rusted, but it opened with a soft snap. I turned the envelope upside down and let the contents slide out onto the ugly patterned carpet of the motel room. The first thing that fell out was a heavy antique brass key. It was entirely unremarkable, the kind of heavy metal key you might use for an old padlock or a forgotten storage shed. It landed with a dull thud. Right behind it was a stack of carefully folded legal documents, perfectly preserved in the dry darkness of the hidden compartment. I picked up the papers, my hands shaking, for an entirely new reason now, and gently unfolded them under the flickering yellow light of the bedside lamp. The heading on the first page made me catch my breath. It was the original charter for an anonymous, limited liability company registered exactly 45 years ago. I recognized the neat, precise handwriting filling out the forms. It was my own handwriting. Suddenly, a rush of deeply buried memories came flooding back to me. 45 years ago, I was a young, ambitious contractor. I had just finished my very first major commercial project, a small shopping plaza downtown. The project finished under budget, and I found myself with a small surplus of cash. Instead of putting it in the bank, I took a wild gamble. I bought 200 acres of completely barren, isolated land up in the freezing mountains of Aspen, Colorado. Back then, it was not the luxurious playground for the wealthy that it is today. It was just an expanse of rocks, pine trees, and freezing wind. I paid absolute pennies for it. Because I was young and trying to protect my new business assets from liability, I created a shell company, an anonymous LLC, to hold the deed. Over the years, I just forgot about it. I never even told Martha about the purchase because, frankly, it was just a worthless patch of dirt in the middle of nowhere, and the business was growing so fast that 200 acres of rocks completely slipped my mind. Then another memory surfaced, sharp and clear. About 20 years ago, I received a strange letter at my construction office. It was from a highly eccentric tech billionaire, a man who had made a fortune in early software and wanted to completely disappear from society. He had somehow tracked down the ownership of that LLC. He wanted to lease my isolated mountain property to build a private off-grid retreat. I had absolutely no use for the land, and I was busy raising Jason and managing a massive construction empire, so I agreed. I leased him the entire 200 acres for exactly $1 a year. But because I was a builder and because I always protected my investments, I had my lawyers draft a very specific ironclad lease agreement. I tucked the final contract into this envelope, placed it in my father's box, and completely forgot about the billionaire, the land, and the LLC. Now sitting on the floor of a cheap motel, I sifted through the remaining pages. Tucked neatly at the very back of the stack was a small, heavy piece of parchment paper. Written on it in bold black ink was a set of precise GPS coordinates pointing directly to the heart of that Aspen property. I stared at those numbers, my mind spinning. Jason and Martha had stolen everything they could find. They had drained the joint accounts, they had transferred the deed to my house, and they had canceled my credit cards. They thought they had completely stripped me of my wealth. But they did not know about this envelope. They did not know about the anonymous LLC, because my name was never directly tied to the public property records. And they certainly did not know about the 200 acres of land sitting in one of the most expensive real estate markets in the country. I looked down at the heavy brass key resting on the carpet. A strange, powerful sense of purpose began to fill my chest, pushing away the cold despair that had almost destroyed me just an hour ago. I was completely broke in Seattle, but I held the deed to a hidden empire in Colorado. I carefully gathered the documents, placed them back inside the manila envelope, and clutched it tightly against my chest. I finally knew exactly what I had to do next. The game was far from over, and I would win. I left the motel before the sun even thought about rising. The Seattle rain had finally stopped leaving behind a bitter, damp cold that seeped right through my thin jacket. I walked out to my 20-year-old pickup truck, the tires crunching softly on the wet gravel. I placed the wooden keepsake box carefully on the passenger seat, strapping it in with the seatbelt like a fragile child. Then I pulled out my cracked cell phone and typed the GPS coordinates into the map application. The screen calculated the route. It was a brutal 1,000-mile drive from the coast of Washington all the way to the high-altitude peaks of Aspen, Colorado. I looked at the fuel gauge. It was resting dead on empty. I drove to the nearest gas station and filled the tank, watching the numbers roll higher and higher on the digital pump. It cost me nearly $100 just to fill it once. With only $800 to my name, I knew exactly how tight this margin was going to be. I bought 2 bottles of water and a cheap bag of stale peanuts. That would be my food for the entire journey. Every single dollar had to go toward gasoline. I turned the ignition key. The old engine coughed, sputtered, and finally roared to life, shaking the entire rusted chassis. I put the truck into gear and pulled onto the highway, leaving my 50 years of marriage completely behind me. The first 12 hours of the drive were a grueling test of sheer physical endurance. At 79 years old, sitting in a worn-out driver's seat with broken springs is pure agony. The constant vibration of the highway radiated up through the floorboards, settling deep into my arthritic knees and lower back. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached, but I refused to pull over. I drove through the endless pine forests of Washington, crossing over the border into the sprawling, empty plains of Idaho. The landscape blurred past my window, matching the chaotic swirl of thoughts in my head. I tried to focus on the road, but the silence inside the cabin was deafening. My mind kept drifting back to Jason and Martha. I pictured them sitting in my warm living room, drinking my expensive wine, laughing about how easily they had discarded me. That image was the only fuel keeping me awake. Whenever my heavy eyelids began to droop, the burning anger in my chest would flare up, sending a fresh jolt of adrenaline straight into my veins. I drove until the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of purple, and bruised black. The darkness stretched out ahead of me, illuminated only by the weak yellow beams of my aging headlights. I finally allowed myself to pull into a dark rest stop just off the interstate. I did not rent a room. I simply locked the doors, leaned the seat back as far as it would go, and closed my eyes. Sleep was completely impossible. The freezing night air seeped through the thin metal doors of the truck. I shivered violently under my damp jacket, hugging my arms across my chest to conserve whatever body heat I had left. As the temperature dropped, the crushing weight of doubt began to creep into my mind. The initial rush of adrenaline from discovering the hidden deed was slowly wearing off, replaced by a cold, terrifying logic. What in the world was I actually doing? I was driving a dying truck toward a patch of remote wilderness I had not seen in almost half a century. The eccentric billionaire who leased the land could have abandoned the project entirely. He might have set up a few trailers and then moved on. I was risking my last dollars, my health, and possibly my life on the slimmest of hopes. If I arrived in Aspen and found nothing but 200 acres of frozen dirt and dead trees, it would truly be the end. I would freeze to death in the cab of this truck entirely alone, thousands of miles away from anyone who even cared to know my name. The fear was paralyzing. It wrapped around my throat like a heavy iron chain. But when morning finally broke, bringing a pale, weak light over the frozen fields, I sat up. I looked at the wooden box resting on the passenger seat. I had absolutely nothing left to lose. I turned the key, forced the stiff gear shift into drive, and merged back onto the highway. The second day was a steep climb into the unforgiving heart of the Rocky Mountains. The air grew incredibly thin, making my chest tighten with every breath. I watched the temperature gauge on my dashboard carefully as the old engine strained against the steep mountain passes. The snow-capped peaks loomed high above me, beautiful, but completely indifferent to my suffering. By the time I crossed into Colorado, I was functioning on pure, unfiltered willpower. My vision was blurry from exhaustion, and my stomach cramped painfully from the lack of real food. Late in the afternoon, the GPS instructed me to exit the main highway. I found myself driving through the pristine, outrageously wealthy outskirts of Aspen. Massive luxury chalets with heated driveways lined the lower ridges. My rusted, mud-splattered truck looked entirely out of place among the imported sports cars. I ignored the strange looks from passing drivers. The digital voice on my phone instructed me to turn onto a narrow gravel road, winding deep into a dense pine forest. The paved asphalt ended abruptly, replaced by sharp rocks and deep ruts. The sun was rapidly setting, casting long, menacing shadows through the thick trees. My heart pounded against my ribs. I was exactly 1 mile away from the coordinates. I gripped the wheel, praying to God that I was not driving into an empty grave. The gravel road chewed at the balding tires of my pickup truck as I crept further up the mountain. Every jarring bump sent a fresh spike of pain up my spine, but I could not bring myself to slow down. The dense canopy of ancient pine trees blocked out what little remained of the evening light, plunging the forest into a deep, disorienting twilight. My headlights, weak and yellowed with age, fought a losing battle against the creeping darkness. I watched the GPS tracker on my phone screen. The small blue dot representing my truck crawled closer and closer to the red pin marking my destination. 1/2 mile, 1/4 mile, 500 feet. My breathing grew shallow. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly they cramped. I was terrified of what I would find at the end of this trail. I expected a clearing filled with overgrown weeds, perhaps a rotting wooden foundation, or the rusted remains of a forgotten trailer. I braced myself for the crushing disappointment of a dead end. The blue dot merged perfectly with the red pin. The digital voice on my phone coldly announced that I had arrived. I slammed my foot on the brake pedal. The truck lurched to a halt, the loose gravel crunching loudly under the tires. I stared straight ahead through the dirty windshield, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I blinked hard, thinking my exhausted mind was playing cruel tricks on me. There was no rotting cabin. There was no empty field. Blocking the entire width of the mountain pass, anchored directly into the solid granite walls on either side, was a massive stainless steel gate. It was a staggering piece of modern engineering. The gate was easily 12 feet high, constructed of thick, reinforced steel beams that gleamed coldly in the wash of my headlights. It looked like the entrance to a military bunker, completely impassable and entirely out of place in this untouched wilderness. A sleek black security box was mounted on a stone pillar to the left, featuring a dark digital keypad and a camera lens that stared back at me like an unblinking eye. I sat in the idling truck for a long moment, completely paralyzed by the sheer scale of the structure. The eccentric billionaire had not just leased my land. He had fortified it. I turned off the engine. The sudden silence of the mountain was deafening, broken only by the whistling of the freezing wind through the pines. I grabbed my flashlight and pushed the heavy truck door open. The biting cold of the aspen evening hit me instantly, slicing right through my thin jacket, but I barely felt it. I walked slowly toward the steel gate, the gravel crunching beneath my boots. Up close, the construction was flawless. As a man who had spent 40 years building commercial structures, I knew immediately that whoever installed this gate had spared absolutely no expense. I walked over to the black security box. The digital screen was blank. I had no access code. I had no remote. I stood there shivering in the wind, staring at an impenetrable wall of steel. Panic began to bubble up in my throat. Had I driven 1,000 miles just to be locked out on the side of a frozen mountain? I raised my flashlight, shining the beam along the side of the stone pillar, desperately searching for a weakness. That is when I saw it. Tucked away beneath a weatherproof metal flap at the very bottom of the security box was an old-fashioned, heavy-duty mechanical lock cylinder. It was a manual override designed to work even if the electronic systems completely failed. My hands started to shake uncontrollably. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the heavy brass key that had fallen from the false bottom of my father's keepsake box. It felt unnaturally cold against my palm. I took a deep breath, knelt down on the frozen dirt, and slid the antique key into the modern lock. It slid in smoothly. I wrapped my stiff fingers around the brass bow and turned it to the right. There was a loud, heavy metallic clank that echoed sharply through the quiet forest. Deep within the steel structure, gears began to grind. Slowly, majestically, the massive stainless steel panels began to slide apart, receding smoothly into the rock walls on either side. I stood up, completely mesmerized, watching the barrier disappear. The path was open. I hurried back to the truck, my fatigue instantly evaporating, replaced by a massive surge of pure adrenaline. I fired up the engine and drove through the stone pillars, my tires gripping a freshly paved, perfectly smooth asphalt driveway that had been hidden entirely behind the gate. The road curved steeply upward, winding elegantly around the natural contours of the mountain. I drove for another 5 minutes, climbing higher and higher into the remote wilderness, my headlights sweeping across beautifully manicured snowbanks and carefully preserved pine groves. Then I rounded the final bend. I brought the truck to a dead stop. I actually forgot how to breathe. Resting gracefully on the massive plateau overlooking the entire valley was an architectural masterpiece. It was a sprawling, multi-level mansion constructed entirely of glass-blackened steel and rich natural stone. It was designed to blend seamlessly into the mountain environment, yet it screamed of absolute unimaginable wealth. Enormous floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the last fading colors of the sunset. The rooflines were perfectly angled, covered in sleek state-of-the-art solar arrays that powered the entire off-grid compound. It was not just a house. It was a modern fortress of luxury, a $25 million estate, completely hidden from the outside world. I stepped out of the truck, leaving the door open. I walked toward the front entrance like a man in a dream. The grand double doors were made of solid walnut, framed by towering walls of glass. I could see the high ceilings inside the custom stonework, the sheer magnitude of the interior space. The billionaire had poured his massive fortune into creating an isolated paradise on the exact plot of dirt I had bought for pennies 4 decades ago. And now, as I stood there in my wet clothes and worn-out shoes, staring at the breathtaking mansion, glowing faintly in the mountain twilight, the reality of my situation finally crashed over me. Jason and Martha had thrown me into the street to steal $2 million. They had no idea I was holding the key to an empire. I pushed open the heavy walnut doors and stepped across the threshold. Instantly, I was enveloped in a wave of deep, comforting warmth. The mansion was completely off the grid, powered by the massive solar arrays I had seen on the roof, but it felt as alive as any home I had ever built. Soft, ambient lighting automatically hummed to life as I walked into the grand foyer, illuminating the rich, natural stone floors and the towering walls of glass that looked out over the darkened valley. It was a cathedral of modern architecture. I stood there, my wet boots dripping onto the pristine floor, completely overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the wealth surrounding me. The air smelled faintly of cedar and expensive leather. I slowly unzipped my damp jacket, letting the heat soak into my aching 79-year-old bones. Just 2 days ago, I had been standing in the freezing rain, thrown out of my own home like a stray dog. Now I was standing inside a $25 million fortress that sat squarely on my own hidden property. I began to explore the first floor, moving quietly, as if I were afraid of waking a sleeping giant. The living area featured a massive 2-story fireplace made of solid river rock surrounded by plush, custom-made furniture. The kitchen was a chef's absolute dream, outfitted with the highest-grade commercial appliances and sleek black marble countertops. Everywhere I looked, there were signs of a man who demanded absolute perfection and had the infinite budget to achieve it. But there were no personal photographs. There was no clutter. The house felt pristine, almost museum-like, as if it had been waiting patiently for someone to claim it. I made my way up a floating staircase of brushed steel and glass, arriving at a wide landing that led to the master wing. At the end of the hall, double doors opened into a sprawling private office. The walls were lined with custom mahogany bookshelves filled with rare first editions and intricate architectural models. In the center of the room sat a massive desk carved from a single slab of reclaimed wood. I walked over and sat down in the heavy leather executive chair. The leather creaked softly in the quiet room. Sitting perfectly centered on the immaculate desk was a thick, cream-colored envelope. It was sealed with a dark red wax stamp. Written across the front in elegant fountain pen script were 3 words: "To the landowner." My hands trembled as I reached out and picked up the envelope. The paper felt thick and expensive. I broke the wax seal and pulled out a single handwritten letter, along with a thick stack of legal documents, bound by a heavy silver clip. I unfolded the letter and began to read. The handwriting belonged to the eccentric tech billionaire who had leased my land 20 years ago. The letter was dated exactly 1 year prior. He wrote that his health was failing rapidly and his doctors had given him only a few months to live. He explained that he had no family, no heirs, and absolutely no desire to leave his beloved mountain retreat to a greedy corporate trust or a squabbling board of directors. He had spent the last 2 decades building this sanctuary to escape the world, and he wanted its fate to be decided by the one thing he respected most in business: an ironclad contract. He had attached the original lease agreement. The very same lease I had ordered my lawyers to draft 40 years ago, back when I was a hungry, protective young contractor trying to cover every possible angle. I set the letter down and picked up the bound legal documents. I flipped through the heavy pages until I found the exact section he had highlighted in bright yellow ink. I read the words slowly, letting their immense weight settle over my exhausted mind. Any structures built on this land will automatically transfer ownership to the landowner upon the tenant's death. I stopped breathing. I read the sentence again, my eyes scanning the crisp black letters. When I leased him the land for $1 a year, I had insisted on that specific clause to ensure I would never be stuck paying for the demolition of whatever strange compound he decided to build. I had just wanted to protect my cheap patch of dirt. I never imagined he would build a $25 million architectural masterpiece, and I certainly never imagined he would simply die and leave it all behind. I turned to the next page of the attached documents. It was a finalized statement from the county tax assessor. The billionaire had not just left me the mansion, knowing that the property taxes on a $25 million estate would instantly bankrupt a normal person. He had prepaid the county taxes for the next 10 full years. The receipt was stamped legally, binding, and completely paid in full. There were no hidden fees, there were no mortgages, there were no liens. The property was free and clear. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair and stared up at the high vaulted ceiling of the office. A strange booming sound echoed through the room. It took me a moment to realize it was the sound of my own laughter. It started as a low chuckle and quickly grew into a full, chest-shaking roar of pure, unfiltered triumph. I was laughing so hard that tears streamed down my weathered face. Jason and Martha thought they had completely destroyed me. They had spent months plotting behind my back, forging documents, and hiding behind my medical vulnerabilities to steal $2.5 million. They thought they had left me with exactly $800 to my name. They thought I would die quietly in a cheap motel. But they had absolutely no idea about the ancient limited liability company. They had no idea about the hidden mountain coordinates. And they certainly had no idea that their cruel, heartless betrayal had just forced me to walk directly into an empire worth 10 times more than everything they had stolen. I was instantly a multimillionaire again. I was sitting in a fortress of wealth, completely invisible to my enemies. The LLC shielded my identity from public records, meaning Jason could not find this property, even if he hired an army of private investigators. He had my old house in Seattle, but I had a kingdom in the clouds. I wiped the tears from my eyes and looked at the brass key resting on the desk. The game had fundamentally changed. I was no longer the victim. I was the ghost in the machine, and it was time to plan my absolute revenge. I spent the rest of that first night exploring every inch of my new fortress. The billionaire had thought of absolutely everything. In the lower level of the mansion, behind a steel door disguised as a wine rack, I found the emergency room. It was stocked with freeze-dried food, medical supplies, and advanced communication equipment. But what truly mattered was sitting in a heavy floor safe bolted to the concrete foundation. The code had been written on the back of the tax document I found in the office. I punched in the numbers and pulled the heavy door open. Inside, stacked in neat vacuum-sealed plastic bags, was exactly $100,000 in unmarked, untraceable $20 and $50 bills. It was an emergency bug-out fund left behind by a paranoid man who wanted to be ready for the end of the world. For me, it was the exact ammunition I needed to start a war. I did not need to wait for courts to unfreeze my old accounts. I did not need to beg a judge for a temporary allowance from my own stolen money. I had cold, hard cash in my hands. I packed $50,000 into a leather briefcase. It was time to hunt. I knew exactly who I needed to call. When you spend 4 decades in the construction business in a city like Seattle, you learn very quickly who the apex predators are. Benjamin Foster was a corporate litigator known for being absolutely ruthless. He did not handle petty family disputes or standard divorces. He destroyed companies. He dismantled hostile takeovers and ruined corrupt executives with a cold, terrifying efficiency. I used the encrypted satellite phone to call his private office line the very next morning. When his secretary tried to brush me off, I gave her a specific access phrase used only by high-net-worth commercial developers. Benjamin picked up the line 30 seconds later. I did not give him my name right away. I told him I was a wealthy investor representing an anonymous limited liability company, and I needed an immediate, devastating forensic audit of a Seattle-based real estate firm. I told him I had a retainer of $50,000 in cash ready to be overnighted to his office via a private courier service from Colorado. Benjamin was a man who respected power and liquidity. He agreed instantly. I drove the briefcase down the mountain to a private shipping facility and sent the money. The trap was officially set. By the end of the week, I transformed the mahogany office into my personal command center. I had 3 large computer monitors set up on the heavy wooden desk, all connected to the secure, high-speed satellite internet that powered the estate. Outside my wall of windows, a serene, heavy snow was falling over the silent pine trees blanketing the mountain in absolute peace. But inside that room, a violent storm was brewing. I sat in my leather chair drinking black coffee, waiting for the first scheduled video briefing. At exactly 10 in the morning, my center monitor flickered to life. Benjamin Foster appeared on the screen. He was sitting in his sleek downtown Seattle office wearing a dark, expensive suit. He looked sharp, hungry, and completely ready for business. I had finally revealed my true identity to him during our second phone call, explaining the horrific betrayal by my wife and son. Rather than turning him away, the sheer audacity of Jason's crime had deeply intrigued him. Benjamin hated sloppy, arrogant criminals, and he loved taking them apart piece by piece. "Mr. Caldwell," Benjamin said, his deep voice carrying clearly through the high-fidelity speakers of the mansion. "I have my team of forensic accountants digging through every public record, tax filing, and corporate shell associated with your son's company. Jason Caldwell Real Estate Holdings is a fascinating puzzle, but it is not a successful business. It is a house of cards waiting for a strong wind." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the mahogany desk. "Tell me everything," I instructed, my voice hard and entirely devoid of any fatherly affection. Benjamin began pulling up spreadsheets and graphs, sharing his screen so I could see the exact anatomy of my son's impending ruin. Jason had been playing the role of the hotshot wealthy developer for years, but it was all smoke and mirrors. He took out massive high-interest loans from predatory firms to fund a lifestyle he could not actually afford. The luxury cars, the expensive country club memberships, the lavish vacations Martha and Rachel constantly bragged about, all of it was financed by dangerous, toxic debt. Jason was bleeding money from every single corporate pore. I watched the red numbers scroll across my screen, representing tens of millions of dollars in outstanding liabilities. A strange mixture of disgust and satisfaction washed over me. This was the brilliant mastermind who had called me a useless old dinosaur. This was the man who claimed he was taking the family legacy to the next level. He was nothing but a desperate gambler who had lost control of the table. Benjamin explained that Jason was facing multiple margin calls and potential lawsuits from his original investors. He had reached a point of absolute financial desperation. That was why he targeted my retirement accounts. The $2.5 million he stole from me was not meant to grow a successful portfolio. It was a panicked, frantic attempt to plug a massive hole in his sinking ship, but the stolen money was not nearly enough to save him. Benjamin smiled thinly through the camera. "Your son is backed into a very dark corner, Harrison," he said smoothly. "He has liquidated every liquid asset he possesses, including your retirement funds. He poured it all into one final gamble." "Let him dig a little deeper," I replied. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair and took a slow sip of my black coffee. The bitter taste grounded me, sharpening my focus as I watched the screen. Benjamin nodded slightly, a cold smile touching the corners of his mouth. He tapped a few keys on his keyboard, and the complex financial spreadsheets on my monitor dissolved. In their place, a series of sleek, high-definition architectural renderings appeared. They showed a massive, sprawling luxury complex nestled against a pristine, snowy mountainside. There were grand ski lodges, built with imported timber, heated outdoor pools glowing in the twilight, and a private gondola system connecting the resort directly to the highest peaks. It looked incredibly ambitious, the kind of vanity project that only a billionaire or a complete fool would attempt to build from scratch. "This is what your son has been working on for the past 3 years, Benjamin explained, his voice perfectly smooth and devoid of any emotion. He calls it the Apex Winter Retreat, Benjamin continued. It is a proposed $100 million luxury resort development located right here in the Aspen Valley. Jason wants to cater exclusively to the ultra-wealthy, offering private helicopter pads, exclusive ski runs, and membership fees that rival small fortunes. It is his ultimate dream, Harrison. He wants to stop being a mid-level commercial developer in Seattle and force his way into the highest echelon of global real estate tycoons. The problem is that he does not have the actual capital to do it. He has been selling a fantasy to his investors. He convinced a group of private equity firms to back the initial development phases, promising them impossible returns within an absurdly short timeline. But building a $100 million fortress in the mountains requires a massive amount of upfront cash, far more than he ever actually raised. I stared at the glossy renderings of the ski resort. I recognized the arrogant ambition in the design. It was exactly the kind of flashy, hollow monument Jason would try to build to prove he was better than his blue-collar father. He was always embarrassed by my calloused hands and my dusty work boots. He wanted to be a man who wore custom suits and sipped champagne with billionaires, but he lacked the fundamental patience and discipline required to build something real. "How short is he, Benjamin?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper in the quiet office. "The financial gap is catastrophic," Benjamin replied instantly. "The initial investor money dried up 6 months ago. The contractors threatened to walk off the site, and the local government was about to revoke his zoning permits due to lack of progress. That is when he became truly desperate." Benjamin brought up another set of documents on the screen. These were bank routing numbers, wire transfer receipts, and heavily redacted internal memos. "This is where your retirement fund comes into the picture, Harrison," he said, leaning closer to his camera. "Jason did not just steal your $2.5 million to buy sports cars or expensive dinners for Martha and his wife. He used your entire life savings as a desperate emergency injection of capital to keep this resort project breathing. He transferred your money through 3 different corporate shell accounts to hide the origin, and then he used it to pay off the angry contractors and renew the expiring permits. He bought himself a few more months of time. He believes that if he can just finish the first phase of construction, he can secure a massive institutional loan to cover his tracks." A cold, hollow feeling settled in my chest. My son had taken the money I bled, for the money meant to secure my final years, and threw it into a burning furnace just to protect his own massive ego. He had literally gambled my life on a mountain of snow. "And what happens when the money runs out again?" I asked, already knowing the answer, but needing to hear Benjamin say the words aloud. Benjamin leaned back, steepled his fingers together, and looked directly into the camera lens. "That is the most interesting part of this entire investigation, Harrison. If a normal business fails, the owner declares bankruptcy, liquidates the remaining assets, and walks away with a damaged reputation. But Jason did not just make bad business decisions. He actively commingled funds. He used the stolen money from your personal accounts to artificially inflate his corporate liquidity." Benjamin paused for a dramatic moment, letting the weight of his words settle over the connection. He submitted falsified financial reports to his private equity investors. Benjamin continued, his tone turning razor sharp. He lied about his cash reserves to secure their initial millions. In the eyes of the law, that elevates this situation from a simple failed business venture to massive federal investor fraud. The Securities and Exchange Commission does not take kindly to mid-level developers lying to institutional investors. If this winter resort project stalls, if he misses even one more critical construction deadline, the investors will demand a full audit. The moment they open his books and see the fabricated numbers and the stolen family money, the federal prosecutors will step in. Jason will not just lose his company and his fancy house in Seattle. He will face a mandatory minimum of 10 years in federal prison. Federal prison. The words echoed loudly in the quiet mahogany office. I turned my chair slightly and looked out the massive window at the falling snow. I held Jason in the hospital delivery room. I had promised to protect him from the harsh realities of the world. Now he had constructed his own personal prison cell out of greed and sheer arrogance. He had sacrificed his own father to build a fantasy resort for the rich. I turned back to the glowing monitors. I felt absolutely no pity. I told Benjamin to send me the complete set of architectural blueprints and civil engineering plans for the resort. A few seconds later, a heavy encrypted file arrived in my inbox. I downloaded the package and extracted the documents onto my desktop. As the high-resolution files populated across my 3 large monitors, I felt a familiar, comforting shift in my mindset. I was no longer just a betrayed father mourning the loss of his family. I was a veteran commercial builder with 40 years of hard-earned experience stepping onto a new job site. I reached into my shirt pocket, pulled out my reading glasses, and leaned close to the glowing screens. The blueprints were incredibly detailed, drawn up by a prestigious, expensive firm out of New York. I spent the next hour ignoring the glossy renderings of the luxury swimming pools and the grand ski lodges. Those were just expensive window dressings designed to dazzle gullible investors. Instead, I focused entirely on the fundamental bones of the project. I looked at the topographic surveys, the grading plans, and the structural foundation requirements. Jason had chosen a beautiful location, but it was a logistical nightmare. The resort was designed to sit in a steep, naturally formed bowl high up in the mountains. It offered breathtaking panoramic views, but from an engineering perspective, it was a massive headache. I studied the elevation markers and the geological reports carefully. The northern and eastern borders of the proposed development were completely blocked by sheer, impassable granite cliffs. The western border abutted a massive tract of federally protected national forest land. This meant absolutely no commercial development or heavy machinery would ever be allowed to cross that strict boundary. The entire $100 million luxury resort was effectively landlocked by extreme geography and strict government regulations. There was only one single narrow corridor where the terrain was gentle enough to support a commercial access road. I opened the master site plan, the document that detailed the roadways, the utility lines, and the primary entrance gates. I traced my finger along the digital screen following the path of the proposed Grand Boulevard. This road would connect the isolated resort to the main public highway down below. The road had to curve precisely through a dense, heavily forested valley. Without this specific road, the resort could not physically exist. You cannot build a luxury destination if the cement trucks, the construction cranes, and the wealthy guests have absolutely no way to reach the front door. I zoomed in on the property boundary lines drawn along the proposed roadway. The blueprints clearly showed that Jason did not actually own the land where the access road was supposed to be built. The road was drawn straight across a neighboring parcel marked on the plans as a pending acquisition. My eyes narrowed. I looked at the surveyor notes and the county parcel identification numbers attached to that specific plot of neighboring land. A strange prickling sensation began to spread across the back of my neck. I quickly minimized the master site plan and opened a separate browser window. I logged into the public property records database for the county and typed in the parcel identification number listed on Jason's blueprints. The database searched for a moment before displaying the final results. The property was listed as exactly 200 acres of undeveloped alpine forest. The current owner was listed as an anonymous limited liability company. I stared at the screen, my heart suddenly hammering, a frantic wild rhythm against my ribs. I knew that limited liability company. It was the exact same company charter sitting in the manila envelope on my desk. I slowly maximized the master site plan again. I superimposed the geographic coordinates of my own property directly over Jason's grand blueprint. The lines matched perfectly. The only viable physical path for the access road, the absolute lifeline of his entire $100 million empire, cut right through the center of my hidden estate. It passed directly beneath the stainless steel gate I had unlocked just a few days ago. Jason had designed his massive fraudulent resort under the arrogant assumption that he could simply buy out the anonymous owner of the neighboring land whenever he was ready. He probably thought it was just a patch of useless timber owned by some distant uninformed holding company. He had no idea that the land was occupied by a $25 million fortress. And he had absolutely no idea that the anonymous owner was the very same father he had just thrown out into the freezing Seattle rain. The sheer absolute poetry of the situation washed over me in a massive wave. I sat perfectly still in the heavy leather chair for a long moment, simply processing the magnitude of what I had just discovered. Then a low rumble started deep in my chest. It bubbled up into my throat and erupted into the quiet mahogany office. I threw my head back and laughed out loud. It was not a chuckle. It was a deep, booming, hysterical roar of laughter that echoed off the high ceilings and the walls of glass. I laughed until my ribs ached and my eyes watered. The universe had a wicked, beautiful sense of justice. Jason had stolen my life savings to build a fraudulent empire, but his entire kingdom was sitting right in the palm of my hand. He was completely trapped in a geographic chokehold, and I was the one holding the leash. I reached out and pressed the button to unmute my microphone. Benjamin Foster was still on the video call watching me with a look of mild concern. "Mr. Caldwell," Benjamin said, raising an eyebrow at me, "are you feeling quite all right?" I wiped a tear of pure joy from my eye and smiled at the camera. "I am doing exceptionally well, Benjamin," I replied, my voice perfectly steady. I just found the fatal flaw in his masterpiece. Benjamin did not waste a second after my discovery. He deployed a team of elite private investigators to monitor every move my son made. I did not just want to ruin Jason on paper. I wanted to watch his arrogant facade crumble piece by piece exactly the way he watched me stand freezing in the rain. Through a secure digital portal Benjamin set up for me, I received daily briefings, intercepted emails, and audio transcripts of Jason's frantic phone calls. It was like watching a rat trapped in a maze that was slowly filling with water. The first sign of Jason's absolute panic started on Monday morning. He realized the deadline for his zoning permits was closing in. He desperately needed to secure the land for the access road, or the entire $100 million project would instantly evaporate. He assigned his best corporate lawyers to track down the owner of the anonymous limited liability company, holding the deed to my 200 acres. I sat in my Aspen office sipping coffee as I read the transcripts of their failed efforts. Jason's lawyers hit a brick wall. The company was registered 45 years ago in Delaware, a state famous for shielding corporate identities. The original registering agent had passed away over a decade ago. There were no public names, no forwarding addresses, and absolutely no phone numbers. The entity was a ghost. By Wednesday, the panic had escalated into sheer terror. Jason's primary investors, a ruthless private equity firm out of Chicago, called an emergency meeting. Thanks to one of Benjamin's contacts inside the firm, I received a detailed summary of the bloodbath. The investors were tired of his endless delays and empty promises. They demanded immediate proof that the access road had been secured. When Jason stammered and tried to buy more time with vague assurances, the lead investor cut him off. He told Jason that if the deed for the neighboring land was not presented within 10 days, they would freeze all construction funds and initiate a forensic federal audit of his entire company. A federal audit. Those two words were the ultimate death sentence for Jason. If they looked at his books, they would find the $2.5 million he stole from me. They would see the fabricated revenue streams. They would see the desperate, illegal shell game he had been playing for the last 3 years. I listened to a recorded phone call between Jason and his lead attorney later that afternoon. Jason's voice was unrecognizable. The smooth, arrogant tone he had used to call me a useless dinosaur was gone. Instead, he sounded like a terrified child. "Find the owner." Jason screamed through the phone, his voice cracking with hysteria. "I do not care what it costs. Hire private detectives, bribe the county clerks, do whatever you have to do. If I do not buy that land by next week, I am going to federal prison. I will lose everything." But no matter how much money he threw at the problem, he could not find me. I was a phantom sitting in a $25 million mansion right above his head, holding the very key to his salvation and his absolute destruction. The contrast between his professional ruin and his personal life was almost comical. One evening, Benjamin sent me a piece of surveillance footage captured by a private investigator parked outside Jason's Seattle estate, the same estate he had stolen from me just weeks prior. The video showed Jason standing in the driveway, leaning heavily against his expensive imported sports car. He looked exhausted. His tie was loosened, his shoulders were slumped, and he was rubbing his temples as if trying to massage away a massive migraine. Suddenly, the front door of the house swung open. Rachel marched down the driveway, completely oblivious to her husband's existential dread. She was holding a stack of glossy shopping bags from a high-end designer boutique downtown. Even through the muffled audio of the surveillance camera, I could hear the shrill, complaining tone of her voice. "Jason, my platinum credit card was declined at the jeweler today," she whined, dropping her hands to her hips in an exaggerated display of frustration. It was humiliating. The manager had to come over and take the card away. "I thought you said we transferred your father's money into the main account. Why is my card bouncing?" Jason lifted his head and stared at his wife. He looked at the expensive clothes she was wearing, the diamond rings glittering on her fingers, and the pile of luxury shopping bags she had just dumped on the driveway. He did not say a word about the investors. He did not mention the looming threat of federal prison. He did not tell her that the money he had stolen from his own father was already gone, swallowed up by the massive debt of the Aspen project. "I will fix it," Jason muttered, his voice hollow and defeated. "Just give me a few days to move some funds around." "Well, hurry up," Rachel snapped, turning on her heel and marching back toward the house. "Martha and I are supposed to go to the country club for a charity luncheon on Friday, and I refuse to show up looking like a peasant." "Fix the card, Jason." Jason stood alone in the driveway as the heavy front door slammed shut behind her. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and stared at the dark screen. He was trapped in a nightmare of his own making. He had surrounded himself with greedy, shallow people who only valued him for the money he could steal. The pressure was mounting rapidly, and I knew he was about to break. It was only a matter of time before he came crawling for a desperate miracle. And when he finally reached out into the dark, I would be the one waiting to pull him under. The following morning, I sat at my mahogany desk, looking out over the snow-covered peaks of Aspen, and picked up the secure satellite phone. I called Benjamin Foster. The phone rang only once. "Benjamin," I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady. "He is isolated and desperate. It is time to throw him the lifeline. Make the call." Benjamin chuckled a low sound, conveying his absolute confidence in our plan. "Consider it done, Mr. Caldwell," he replied. "I will contact his legal team within the hour. I will make sure they understand that the owner of this limited liability company is a man who does not negotiate and does not tolerate delays." I kept the audio feed open as Benjamin initiated contact, wanting to hear every word of my son's impending doom. Benjamin did not call Jason directly. Instead, he routed the call through the senior partner of the law firm representing Jason. When the senior partner answered, Benjamin introduced himself as the exclusive legal representative for the anonymous owner of the Aspen Alpine parcel. The reaction on the other end of the line was immediate and electric. The partner practically tripped over his own words, desperately trying to arrange an immediate conference call with Jason. They had hunted this ghost for weeks, and suddenly, the ghost knocked on their front door. Within 10 minutes, the secure conference line was established. I sat in silence in my fortress, listening to the static hum of the connection. Then Jason's voice came through the speakers. He was breathing heavily, trying to sound like a composed executive, but the underlying panic was painfully obvious. "Mr. Foster." Jason began, his tone dripping with forced professionalism. "We are pleased you reached out. We tried to locate your client regarding a mutual development opportunity." Benjamin did not return the pleasantries. He deployed his weaponized corporate indifference. "Mr. Caldwell." Benjamin interrupted, his voice completely flat and devoid of any warmth. Skip the preamble. My client is a highly private individual with massive international holdings. He does not care about your development opportunity. He does not want to be your partner. He is aware that your proposed winter resort is completely landlocked without his 200 acres. You need an access road, and you made a fatal error by beginning construction before securing the geographic rights. There was a long, agonizing silence on the line. Jason had just been completely stripped of his leverage. He was exposed. Yes, Jason finally admitted, his voice noticeably smaller. We are prepared to offer your client a very generous buyout for that specific parcel. We have a valuation report that prices the raw land at approximately $2 million. We are willing to offer $2.5 million to expedite the transfer. I smiled grimly at the number. $2.5 million. The exact amount of money he had stolen from my retirement accounts. He was trying to use my own stolen money to buy my own hidden land. The sheer blinding arrogance of the boy was staggering. Benjamin let out a sharp, dismissive sigh. Mr. Caldwell, you are fundamentally misunderstanding your position in this negotiation, he said coldly. You are not buying raw land. You are buying the survival of your entire $100 million project, and frankly, your freedom from investor litigation. My client is not interested in your appraisals. He is willing to part with the property, but there is only one price and there will be absolutely no counteroffers. Name the price, Jason said, his breathing growing shallow. $15 million, Benjamin stated smoothly. Jason let out a choked gasp. $15 million. That is insane. That is pure extortion. The land is just dirt and pine trees. Nobody pays $15 million for an unpermitted access corridor. My client just did, Benjamin replied without missing a beat. The price is $15 million, pure liquid cash. My client will not accept stock options, he will not accept a stake in your resort, and he will not wait for you to secure a commercial bank loan. The funds must be wired in full directly into our escrow account. Furthermore, because my client finds this entire interaction tedious, this offer is only valid for exactly 7 days. If the money is not in the account by close of business next Friday, the offer is permanently revoked. The land will be placed into a conservation trust, and you will never be able to build your road. I could practically hear the walls closing in on Jason. $15 million in pure cash within a single week is an astronomical demand for a healthy company, let alone one that is secretly drowning in toxic debt. Jason tried to argue. He tried to plead. He talked about market rates and fair practices, but Benjamin simply talked right over him. 7 days. Mr. Caldwell, Benjamin repeated, his voice like the slam of a heavy vault door. I strongly suggest you stop complaining and start liquidating. Good day. The line went dead. I leaned back in my chair, staring out at the snow falling silently over the Aspen Valley. The bait was officially set, and the hook was massive. Jason was entirely trapped. He could not walk away from the deal. If he lost the land, the investors would audit him, the stolen retirement money would be discovered, and he would spend the next decade in a federal penitentiary. The only way to save himself from prison was to buy the land. But to buy the land, he had to find $15 million in 7 days. He had already drained my accounts. He had already tapped out his credit lines. There was only one place left for him to get that kind of money. He would have to cannibalize his own life. He would have to strip Martha and Rachel of everything they valued. The destruction of their perfect, greedy little world had officially begun, and they were going to do it to themselves. The 7-day countdown began like a ticking time bomb in the center of their lives. From my command center in the Aspen Mansion, I watched the destruction unfold through Benjamin's relentless surveillance network. Jason had no time to secure a traditional commercial loan. Even if he did have the time, no reputable banking institution would ever authorize $15 million in liquid cash within a week for a company carrying his toxic debt load. He had to cannibalize the very foundation of his life, and the first thing on the chopping block was the beautiful Seattle estate he had stolen from me. By Tuesday morning, Benjamin intercepted a panicked phone call between Jason and Martha. Jason drove over to the house and laid out the terrifying reality. He did not tell her about the impending federal audit or the possibility of prison. He was far too proud and deceitful for that. Instead, he spun a massive delusional lie. He told his mother that this $15 million land purchase was the absolute final hurdle, the golden key that would unlock a billion-dollar valuation for his winter resort. He promised her that if they could just scrape the cash together now, they would be richer than they ever imagined. Driven by her own insatiable greed and her blind, foolish faith in her son, Martha swallowed the bait completely. She agreed to quietly sell the estate. Jason bypassed the traditional real estate market entirely to avoid any delays. He reached out to a predatory investment group. He knew the kind of corporate vultures who buy luxury properties for cash at a steep discount, provided the closing happens in a matter of days. They sold my home, the house I built brick by brick, with my own hands for a fraction of its true value, just to get the liquid capital immediately. Surveillance showed unmarked moving trucks arriving in the dead of night to clear out the expensive furniture, ensuring the neighbors would not ask questions. Martha packed her bags with a smile, completely oblivious to the fact that she was effectively making herself homeless. Martha did not stop at the house. The surveillance reports showed her marching into her bank and draining every single personal account she had. She cashed out her private life insurance policies, paying massive early withdrawal penalties without a second thought. She even pawned the expensive diamond jewelry and the vintage Rolex watches I had bought for her over our 50 years of marriage. She stripped herself of every financial safety net she possessed, handing the money over to Jason with the greedy expectation of becoming a billionaire matriarch. Rachel, of course, complained endlessly about the sudden lack of funds, completely unaware that her husband was selling the ground right out from under her feet. But even with the rushed sale of the house and Martha emptying her accounts, Jason was still millions of dollars short. The panic set back in darker and significantly more desperate this time. By Thursday night, the surveillance took a deeply sinister turn. Jason was completely out of legal options, so he turned to the underground. Benjamin sent me a series of grainy photographs taken by a private investigator in a dimly lit parking garage on the industrial side of Seattle. The photos showed Jason standing nervously next to a black luxury sedan, talking to two massive men who did not look like real estate investors. They were high-level loan sharks, the kind of dangerous shadow financiers who cater to desperate gamblers and failing executives. These men do not ask for credit scores, and they do not file paperwork with the government. They lend massive amounts of dirty money at astronomical illegal interest rates, and they do not take collateral in the form of property. They take it in flesh and blood. According to Benjamin's underworld contacts, Jason borrowed the remaining millions he needed directly from these men. He signed his life away on a simple piece of paper, agreeing to terms that would bankrupt a small country in mere weeks. He was so completely blinded by his own arrogance, so convinced that the Aspen resort would miraculously save him, that he willingly climbed into bed with actual monsters. He genuinely believed it was just a temporary bridge loan. He thought that once the land was his, the private equity investors would release the $100 million construction fund, and he could pay off the loan sharks before they ever came looking for him. It was a masterclass in absolute self-destruction. I sat in my quiet, warm office staring at the photographs on my monitor. I felt a strange, cold shiver run down my spine, but it was not out of pity. It was the chilling realization of exactly who my son truly was. He was a man with absolutely no moral compass, no boundaries, and no sense of self-preservation. He had thrown his own mother into the street and borrowed from violent criminals, all to protect his own fragile ego. He had risked absolutely everything he had, and everything his family had on a single desperate roll of the dice. By Friday morning, the final day of the deadline, Benjamin called me with the ultimate confirmation. The massive bleeding wound Jason had inflicted on his own life was finally complete. The $15 million had been successfully pooled together into a single highly leveraged corporate holding account. The money was a toxic cocktail of stolen retirement funds, the liquidated assets of a betrayed wife, and the dirty cash of Seattle loan sharks. It was sitting there ready to be wired. Jason contacted Benjamin's office just before noon. His voice was trembling with a sickening mixture of exhaustion and manic triumph. "We have the funds," Jason said, practically gasping for air over the secure phone line. "The $15 million is liquid and ready for immediate transfer. We want to close this deal today. We want the deed to the Aspen property by this afternoon." Benjamin looked at me through the video feed, muttering a silent, grim confirmation. Jason had put a loaded gun directly to his own head, handed me the weapon, and begged me to pull the trigger. I did not pull it immediately. I let him sweat for another agonizing 12 hours. The final deadline was set for 5:00 in the afternoon on Friday. I woke up long before dawn that morning, the crisp mountain air filling my lungs as I stepped out onto the glass balcony of the Aspen mansion. The world was quiet, wrapped in a blanket of fresh, untouched snow. I brewed a pot of dark roast coffee and carried it into my mahogany command center. I sat down in the heavy leather chair, woke up my computer monitors, and opened the secure banking portal for my anonymous limited liability company. The balance on the screen read 0. It sat there, a silent testament to the trap I had carefully laid. I spent the morning watching the clock tick closer and closer to the deadline. Benjamin Foster checked in every hour, confirming that Jason's legal team was frantically finalizing the pooling of their toxic assets. They were combining the pennies Martha had scraped together from her pawned jewelry, the millions stripped from my stolen Seattle estate, and the incredibly dangerous, dirty cash handed over by the underground loan sharks. It was a cocktail of absolute desperation, and it was all about to flow directly into my hands. At exactly 2:00 in the afternoon, my computer speakers emitted a soft, high-pitched chime. It was the notification sound for an incoming high-value wire transfer. I leaned forward, my hands resting flat on the cool wood of the desk, and watched the computer screen refresh. The small, spinning, loading icon seemed to hover there for an eternity. Then the numbers finally populated. The balance of the account was no longer 0. It read exactly $15 million. I stared at the screen, letting my eyes trace the commas and the zeros. This was not just a sum of money. This was the total quantified weight of my son's hubris. It was his entire present and his entire future completely surrendered to a faceless entity he thought he could outsmart. The moment the funds cleared the federal wire system and settled into my account, Benjamin Foster executed the next phase of our plan. He immediately filed a heavily encrypted, legally binding motion to lock the escrow account. The $15 million was instantly frozen. Jason could not pull it back. He could not reverse the wire. He was completely tethered to the trap, and the heavy iron door had just locked firmly behind him. Less than an hour after the wire transfer cleared, Jason called Benjamin's office. The terrified, stammering boy from the previous week was completely gone. In his place was the arrogant, insufferable corporate developer I recognized all too well. Having successfully secured the massive sum of money and believing he had just saved his $100 million mountain resort, Jason's ego inflated to a grotesque size. He felt invincible. He felt like a titan of industry who had just navigated a massive corporate crisis. "Mr. Foster," Jason said, his voice dripping with renewed condescension over the intercepted audio feed. "The $15 million is sitting in your client's account exactly as demanded. Now my legal team has prepared the final transfer deeds for the 200 acres. You can send them over for a digital signature, but frankly, I think a transaction of this magnitude deserves a proper formal closing." Benjamin sounded mildly amused. "A formal closing?" Mr. Caldwell, what exactly do you have in mind? Jason cleared his throat, leaning into his newfound, completely fabricated sense of power. I have reserved the executive penthouse boardroom at the downtown Seattle Financial Tower for tomorrow afternoon. I will be bringing my wife Rachel and my mother Martha to celebrate the finalization of the resort expansion. And I expect your anonymous client to be there in person to sign the final paperwork. I want to meet the man I just gave $15 million to. We are neighbors now, after all. It is only fitting that we shake hands and perhaps discuss future synergies between our portfolios. I listened to his ridiculous speech and actually shook my head in absolute disbelief. He did not just want to sign the papers, he wanted an audience. He wanted to parade his mother and his wife into a lavish boardroom to prove that he was a brilliant mastermind. He wanted to rub shoulders with the mysterious billionaire he thought he was doing business with, desperate to gain entry into an elite club of ultra-wealthy tycoons. He wanted to look the apex predator right in the eye, completely unaware that he was simply walking onto a silver platter. Benjamin muted his line and called me on a separate, secure channel. You heard him, Harrison. Benjamin said, a dark chuckle escaping his throat. He is demanding a face-to-face meeting. I can easily decline and force a digital signature. We have the money. We do not need to indulge his theater. I looked out the window at the towering, silent pines. I thought about the cold, freezing rain in Seattle. I thought about the police officers telling me I had to leave my own home. I thought about the cheap plastic key to the motel room and the black trash bag holding the miserable remnants of my 50 years of marriage. Jason wanted a show. He wanted a grand finale and a penthouse boardroom in the sky. Tell him we accept, I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. Tell him the owner of the limited liability company will be there tomorrow afternoon. Tell him to bring the champagne. Benjamin agreed and relayed the message to Jason. The excitement in Jason's voice was palpable as he confirmed the time and the address. He hung up the phone, believing he was about to step into the greatest triumph of his entire miserable life. I stood up from my desk and walked over to the heavy oak wardrobe in the master suite. I had not worn a suit since the day I retired from my construction firm. But the billionaire who owned this mansion had left behind a closet full of custom-tailored Italian suits, and ironically, we were exactly the same size. I pulled out a charcoal gray wool suit, a crisp white shirt, and a dark silk tie. I laid them out carefully on the massive king-sized bed. I was going back to Seattle, but I was not returning as Harrison Caldwell, the tired, broken old man they had thrown into the gutter. I was returning as the architect of their absolute destruction. I packed a small leather travel bag, locked the doors of my mountain fortress, and began the long drive down the mountain toward the private airfield. The trap was fully loaded, the stage was lavishly set, and the actors were all eagerly taking their places. Tomorrow, the curtain would finally fall. The flight to Seattle was incredibly smooth. A private black car was waiting for me. As the sedan glided through the rain-slicked streets of the city, I felt absolutely no nostalgia. I looked out at the towering skyscrapers I had helped build for 40 years. I was completely transformed by their betrayal. I stepped out at the downtown financial tower, the charcoal gray wool of my custom Italian suit resting perfectly against my shoulders. I did not look like a retired contractor. I looked like a man who owned the entire block. I rode the private elevator up to the executive penthouse level. The doors slid open with a soft, melodic chime, revealing a sprawling reception area decorated in dark marble and brushed steel. Benjamin was waiting for me near the entrance of the primary boardroom. He gave me a brief, approving nod, his eyes taking in my transformation. The boardroom itself was encased entirely in heavy soundproof glass, allowing me to observe the occupants inside before I made my presence known. I stood in the quiet hallway, my hands resting casually in my pockets, and watched my family celebrate their own execution. Jason was standing at the head of the massive mahogany table. He was wearing a sharp navy suit, looking every bit the arrogant corporate tycoon he desperately wanted to be. He was holding a crystal flute of expensive champagne, gesturing grandly as he spoke. Seated to his right was Martha. She was wearing a new designer dress, her hair perfectly styled, a smug, self-satisfied smile plastered across her face. She looked like a woman who believed she had successfully outsmarted the entire world. Next to her sat Rachel, eagerly examining her own reflection in the polished wood of the table, undoubtedly dreaming of the luxury boutiques she would soon raid. They were completely oblivious to the impending disaster. They were raising their glasses, toasting to the $15 million they had just handed over to a ghost, convinced it was the golden ticket to their billionaire status. I took a slow, deep breath. The anger that had burned inside me for the last week had crystallized into something incredibly cold and precise. I reached out and gripped the heavy brass handles of the double boardroom doors. I pushed them open. The thick glass doors swung inward with a heavy, authoritative thud. The sound immediately drew their attention. Jason stopped mid-sentence, turning his head toward the entrance with an expectant, eager smile, fully prepared to greet the anonymous billionaire who had just saved his life. Martha shifted in her expensive leather chair, adjusting her posture to look appropriately wealthy and sophisticated. I stepped over the threshold and walked slowly into the center of the room. The heavy soles of my leather shoes clicked softly against the polished hardwood floor. I did not rush. I carried myself with the absolute certainty of a man who holds all the cards. I stopped at the opposite end of the long mahogany table, clasped my hands behind my back, and simply looked at them. The reaction was instantaneous and profoundly beautiful. Jason's eager smile froze, then twisted into an expression of sheer, unadulterated horror. His eyes widened to an impossible size, darting frantically from my perfectly tailored suit to the calm, ruthless expression on my face. The muscles in his jaw went completely slack. The expensive crystal champagne flute slipped right through his trembling fingers. It hit the hardwood floor of it with a sharp, violent crash, shattering into 1,000 glittering pieces. The champagne splashed across the polished wood and soaked into the cuffs of his tailored trousers, but he did not even blink. He simply stared at me, his chest heaving, as if all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the room. Martha was equally paralyzed. The smug, self-satisfied smile vanished from her lips so fast it was almost comical. All the color drained completely out of her face, leaving her skin a sickening, chalky white. She gripped the padded armrests of her chair so tightly that her knuckles popped. Her mouth opened slightly, as if she were trying to speak, but her vocal cords completely failed her. She looked as though she had just seen a dead man climb out of his grave and walk into her pristine corporate sanctuary. Only Rachel seemed confused. She looked from Jason to me, clearly not understanding why her husband and mother-in-law were reacting as if the devil himself had just walked through the door. Benjamin Foster stepped into the room behind me, smoothly closing the heavy glass doors to seal us all inside. He walked over and stood dutifully at my right side, opening his leather briefcase and pulling out the final transfer documents. "What is going on here?" Rachel finally broke the heavy, suffocating silence, her voice shrill and irritated. "Jason, why is your father here? I thought we were meeting the owner of the land." Jason did not answer her. He could not physically bring himself to speak. He just kept staring at me, his mind desperately trying to process the impossible reality standing right in front of him. The old, useless dinosaur he had thrown into the rain was now standing in a penthouse boardroom, wearing clothes that cost more than Jason's car, flanked by the most ruthless corporate attorney in the city. I let the silence stretch out for another 10 seconds, letting the sheer terror fully marinate in their minds. Then I rested my hands flat on the edge of the mahogany table. "Good afternoon, Jason," I said. My voice was calm, deep, and perfectly steady. It echoed loudly in the quiet glass-walled room. "I understand you have been desperately looking for me. It is a pleasure to finally do business with you. You wanted to meet the man who held the keys to your entire future. Well, here I am, and I assure you, this meeting will be unforgettable." Jason finally found his voice, though it sounded like it belonged to a frightened little boy. "Dad," he stammered, his eyes darting frantically between me and the briefcase resting in Benjamin Foster's hands. "What are you doing here? Did you follow me? If you came to beg for a handout, you chose the absolute worst possible time. We are in the middle of closing a massive corporate transaction. You need to leave right now before the owner of the land arrives." "You are embarrassing me." I did not move a single inch. I simply looked at him with a mixture of profound pity and absolute disgust. "I am not here to ask you for anything." "Jason," I replied, my voice slicing through the heavy air of the boardroom, "I am here to close the transaction." I reached into the breast pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out the original yellowed charter for the anonymous limited liability company. I tossed it casually onto the center of the massive mahogany table. It slid across the polished wood and came to a stop directly in front of Jason's trembling hands. "Read it," I commanded. Jason stared at the old document as if it were a venomous snake. He slowly reached out and turned the paper toward him. His eyes scanned the crisp black ink tracing the name of the company and the original date of incorporation from 45 years ago. Then his eyes fell upon the signature at the very bottom of the page. It was my signature, Harrison Caldwell. The color drained from his face completely, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. "You," Jason whispered, his voice cracking violently. "You are the owner. You own the 200 acres in Aspen." "That is correct," I said smoothly. "I bought that dirt for pennies when I was just starting out in the construction business. I leased it to a billionaire 20 years ago, and upon his death, the entire $25 million estate he built transferred directly back to me. While you were throwing me into the freezing rain to steal my retirement savings, I was holding the geographic keys to your entire fraudulent empire." Martha let out a sharp, ragged gasp, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. Rachel looked completely lost, her eyes darting between her husband and the man she thought was a broke, helpless senior citizen. Jason stumbled backward, his legs hitting the edge of his expensive leather chair. He gripped the backrest to keep himself from collapsing onto the floor. "But we just wired the money," Jason choked out, a manic, desperate light flashing in his eyes. "We sent $15 million to your account. You have to sign the deed over to me right now. If I do not get that land, the investors will pull out. I will lose the resort." I took a slow, deliberate step forward, resting my hands firmly on the edge of the table. "I am not signing anything, Jason," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. "I am not selling you the land. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. The Aspen estate is my new home, and I do not want a massive, noisy winter resort built in my backyard." "But the money," Jason screamed, his carefully crafted corporate persona shattering into a million jagged pieces. "You took the $15 million. You have to give it back if you are not selling." This is where Benjamin Foster stepped forward, opening his leather briefcase with a satisfying click. "Actually, Mr. Caldwell," Benjamin said, his tone dripping with professional satisfaction, "my client does not have to give you a single dime. The $15 million you wired this afternoon has been legally frozen by a federal judge. We filed an emergency injunction the moment the funds hit the escrow account." Jason stared at the lawyer, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. "Frozen? Why? You cannot do that. That is theft." Benjamin smiled, a cold, predatory expression. "It is not theft, Mr. Caldwell. It is restitution. You forged a medical proxy to steal $2.5 million from your father. We have documented proof of the unauthorized wire transfers. The judge immediately froze the $15 million to cover the stolen retirement funds, plus massive punitive damages for severe elderly financial abuse, grand larceny, and corporate fraud. We are going to drain every single penny of that frozen account through civil litigation. You handed us the exact weapon we needed to destroy you." The absolute reality of his ruin finally crashed down on Jason. He had no land. He had no resort. The money he had squeezed from his mother's accounts, the money from the stolen Seattle estate, and the incredibly dangerous cash he had borrowed from the underground loan sharks was all gone. It was locked away in a federal vault, completely out of his reach. He was going to owe millions to violent criminals, and he had absolutely no way to pay them back. "Dad, please," Jason dropped to his knees right there on the hardwood floor, his designer suit wrinkling awkwardly. Tears streamed down his face. "You cannot do this to me. I will be killed. You have to give the money back. I am your son. You ceased being my son the moment you locked me out in the rain." I replied coldly, staring down at him, without a single ounce of mercy. Suddenly, the heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open once more. Two men in dark windbreakers stepped into the room, their expressions grim and strictly professional. The letters FBI were printed boldly in bright yellow across their backs. Benjamin Foster had not just filed a civil lawsuit. He had handed over the entire dossier of Jason's fabricated financial reports, the commingled stolen funds, and the fraudulent investor records directly to the federal authorities. Jason Caldwell, the lead agent, announced, pulling out heavy steel handcuffs. "Stand up." The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs echoing in that silent glass boardroom was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Jason tried to pull his arms away, but the federal agents were devoid of patience. They yanked him up, twisting his arms behind his back. He did not look like a tycoon anymore. He looked like a terrified, broken little boy who had finally been caught stealing from the cookie jar. He looked back at me over his shoulder as they marched him toward the heavy glass doors, his face stained with tears, pleading for a rescue that was never going to come. I did not blink. I did not flinch. I watched the doors close behind him, sealing his fate forever. Then the silence returned, heavier and more suffocating than before. Rachel was backed up against the far wall of the boardroom, her hands covering her mouth, shaking violently, as she realized her luxurious, pampered life had just evaporated into thin air. But it was Martha who finally broke. She collapsed onto her knees, the expensive fabric of her new designer dress pooling awkwardly around her on the floor. She crawled forward, reaching out with trembling hands to grab the hem of my trousers. "Harrison," she sobbed, her voice a pathetic, high-pitched wail that echoed off the cold glass walls. "Please, Harrison, you cannot do this to us. You cannot let them take our boy away. I am so sorry. I was foolish. I was confused. We have been married for 50 years. 50 years of history of building a family together. You cannot just erase all of that. Please look at me. Look at your wife. Have mercy on us." I looked down at the woman who had shared my bed, eaten at my table, and smiled in my face while secretly plotting my absolute ruin. I felt nothing. The love I once had for her had been completely burned away, leaving behind a cold, impenetrable ash. I stepped back, forcing her to release her desperate grip on my suit. I adjusted my jacket and looked down at her tear-stained face. "You divorced a broke old man in the rain, Martha," I said, my voice devoid of any warmth or forgiveness. "The man standing here does not know you." I turned my back on her and walked out of the boardroom. Benjamin Foster followed behind me, leaving Martha and Rachel alone to face the absolute devastation they had brought upon themselves. I walked out of the downtown financial tower, stepped into the private car, and told the driver to take me straight back to the airfield. I was finally going home. The aftermath of that afternoon was swift and brutal. Benjamin kept me updated on the legal bloodbath over the next few months. Jason was denied bail. The federal prosecutors used the frozen $15 million as the cornerstone of their massive fraud case. Confronted with the overwhelming evidence of forged medical proxies, commingled stolen funds, and fabricated corporate documents, his defense crumbled. He was sentenced to 12 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. His real estate company was seized and liquidated, his reputation destroyed forever. Martha and Rachel suffered a fate that was worse than prison. Because the frozen funds were tied up in federal restitution, and because they had willingly liquidated every asset they owned to secure that fraudulent wire transfer, they were left with nothing. No house, no savings, and no credit. But the true nightmare for them was not just poverty. It was the underground loan sharks. Those violent men did not care about federal court cases or frozen assets. They wanted their money, and Jason was locked away where they could not reach him. The debt fell directly onto Martha and Rachel. Benjamin reported that they were forced to flee Seattle, disappearing into the shadows, moving from one cheap, dingy motel to another, constantly looking over their shoulders, hunted by the very monsters they had eagerly invited into their levos. They had thrown me out into the street, and now the street had swallowed them whole. As for me, I returned to the majestic silence of the Aspen Mountains. I walked through the massive stainless steel gates and breathed in the pure, freezing air. I was no longer a victim. I had reclaimed my life, my dignity, and my fortune. But a $25 million mansion is too large a space for one man to live in alone. A few weeks after my return, I drove down to the local animal shelter. I walked past the purebred puppies and found two old battered rescue dogs who had been abandoned by their previous owners. They were cautious, scarred, and tired. I knew exactly how they felt. I adopted them both on the spot. They now spend their days sleeping in front of the massive river rock fireplace, completely safe and fiercely loyal. I did not just keep the wealth to myself. With Benjamin's help, I established a foundation dedicated to providing aggressive legal representation for victims of elderly financial abuse. I used the recovered money to hire a team of ruthless attorneys who hunt down predatory relatives and corrupt caretakers. I made sure that no other senior citizen would ever have to stand in the freezing rain, stripped of their dignity and their life savings. Every evening as the sun sets over the snowy peaks, I pour myself a glass of expensive bourbon. I sit in my heavy leather chair, my dogs resting at my feet, and I look out over the vast, untouched wilderness that belongs entirely to me. I found absolute peace in the shadows they tried to bury me in. They thought they could throw me away like trash, but trash does not build a $25 million empire from the shadows. Do you think they got what they deserved? Subscribe and let me know down in the comments.